Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm here once again with the host of Atun-Shei Films, Andy Rakich, here to talk about his newest feature-length film that just came out really in the past couple of weeks. I know it's been percolating through indie theaters and other venues for a little bit. Maybe you've seen his announcement on YouTube for how you guys can get the film as well. I've now seen it, and we are going to talk about his movie. We're going to break it down into two parts. One part for spoiler-free discussion, and then after a little bit, we'll do a spoiler section. And we'll mark that pretty clearly so you guys can skip around to whichever section you prefer. So I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself, introduce the film, and then we can kind of move from there.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on once again. And yeah, you did a great job introducing me. For those of you who don't know, I run the YouTube channel Atun-Shei Films, which is primarily focused on American history. Has a number of series of kind of wildly different sort of tones and genres that hopefully sort of present history in a entertaining and cinematic and irreverent way. And I made this film, The Sudbury Devil. It premiered in September at the Satanic Temple World Headquarters in Salem, Massachusetts. It enjoyed a limited theatrical run in art house indie theaters in 3 countries, the US, UK, and Australia, and a lot of really cool venues, like the sorts of places with graffiti in the bathroom, And now I'm self-distributing the film via my website, atunsheifilms.com, starting December 21st. And I guess by the time we're recording this a little bit before, but maybe by the time this is out, it will be already released and available to watch. So I hope you guys check it out and enjoy it.
So, how did you decide on the topic and setting for this story? In your YouTube work, you've done a lot, obviously, with King Philip's War, early colonial America. And spoiler alert, the movie takes place in early colonial America in the aftermath of King Philip's War. So, why did you decide on that for the setting of your story as opposed to something in your adopted hometown of New Orleans?
Yeah, sure. So I have always wanted to bring this particular period of history to life on screen, because it's pretty underrepresented in cinema. And I thought that King Philip's War especially would be just a great setting for a film. The first feature screenplay I ever wrote was in film school, and I think it was just called King Philip's War, and it was essentially kind of a historical epic set in this war, sort of surrounding the Sudbury fight, and that's kind of where when I wrote that script, that's kind of where I discovered my sort of uncanny ability to imitate early modern English dialogue. So I kind of, especially writing that, I kind of realized like, ooh, this would be a really cool setting, not only for the historical kind of nerdy purposes, but also just for this language, for this early modern English language that I just really enjoy writing in. And of course, that script and a lot of the other sort of follow-up scripts that I wrote on the topic were extremely expensive, right? Were very would have cost millions of dollars and had battle scenes and a bunch of extras and guns going off and the murders and towns burning and all that sort of stuff. So I just kind of realized, when I was gearing up to kind of make this movie, I kind of landed on this more sort of horror film angle, but based on a lot of the same themes that original script and that some of the follow up kind of, I guess when I kind of rewritten that script or sort of reconceptualized sort of a King Philip's War story, a lot of the same themes kind of carried over. But I kind of figured by sort of having it be a horror film and specifically a witchcraft film, of course, there's, in sort of popular culture and in cinema, the sort of Puritan witchcraft film and Puritan witchcraft story, that's a genre unto itself. And there's kind of a tradition to build on there. And so I decided, making this a supernatural horror film can sort of allow me to explore these themes as a filmmaker, but in a more kind of allegorical sense, right? In a less direct sense. Where in this film, it's not set during King Philip's War, but King Philip's War it casts a very long shadow over the events of the film and over all the characters in it. So yeah, this was kind of my way to do that on a budget.
I got that. So we're kind of building off of the idea of that tradition of Puritan horror films that you're coming from. What can you tell us a little bit about what some of the cinematic influences on your film were? So, I mean, I'm not a particular cinephile. I've seen things like The Witch, which seemed to be kind of a big market appeal, kind of similar idea. But were there other influences that were at work here? Were there other filmmakers, other topics, other genres that were also playing a role in this?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, from a kind of purely sort of marketing, I guess, business perspective, yeah. I mean, The Witch is a great movie, and it's obviously sort of it definitely occurred to me, sort of when I was gearing up to start pre-production, the fact that I thought that this might be kind of a marketable film that people might want to see is because that movie made money, and and that was kind of a weird esoteric, dorkily historically accurate film set in this time period. So it's kind of a bit of a proven, I guess there's an appetite for that, right? So that was definitely like a marketing decision for sure. From kind of a more creative and artistic perspective, I think there were three sort of main influences on this film. The first was The Witchfinder General from 1968, starring Vincent Price, which, for those of you familiar with my channel, of course, are probably familiar with the Witchfinder General series that I do, which is sort of a more comedic series where, a witch hunter reacts to, Reddit and stuff, and, presidential debates and everything. But yeah, the Witchfinder General film, based very loosely on the life of Matthew Hopkins, the infamous mass murderer and witch hunter during the English Civil War. And specifically, a lot of some of the character dynamics in our film are inspired very much from that. We have two witch hunters, and one is kind of the brain, and the other is kind of the muscle. One is sort of the learned man, and the other one is this sort of former soldier, this military man who's sort of he's Cutting, who's the sort of more learned witch hunter in our film. He's the one going around with a copy of Malleus Maleficarum and James the First's demonology, and he's kind of doing all the intellectual stuff and all the the courtroom debating and all that. And Fletcher is the one who's actually stringing up the old ladies, and he's the one who's actually kind of roughing people up. And that dynamic was in Witchfinder General, which I really enjoyed, between Matthew Hopkins and his sort of servant, who was the guy who would sort of rough people up. So I really love that character dynamic. And then the second, probably the biggest influence, is Ravenous, my favorite film, directed by Antonia Bird, which really sort of inspired a lot of the thematic elements of the Sudbury Devil. Ravenous is a pretty brutal satirical attack on American conservatism, on the myth making in American history, and I think we very much owe a lot to Antonia Bird in that sense for how our film sort of explores these topics. And I like to think we go even a little bit further than Ravenous did in that way. And then the third, which had a major visual influence, would be Ben Wheatley's A Field in England, which is a more recent film from 2013, which is also set during the English Civil War, and is this kind of crazy psychedelic psycho art house. What the fuck? Kind of historical adventure story. And I always loved the editing in that film. And there's certain moments in the Sudbury Devil where that's a bit of a love letter to A Field in England for sure.
Building off of that, actually, one thing that you mentioned, the copy of the Malleus Maleficarum and that kind of intellectual versus bronze side. This is more of an aside. What was the influence on, because Malleus Maleficarum was a Catholic work written on hunting witches and so on, and I'm curious, what was the relationship between that intellectual tradition and the Puritan tradition, which decried all things that smacked of papistry? Why was that okay?
Well, it wasn't okay, but they didn't use those ideas directly, but they stole from them a whole hell of a lot. So basically, the main kind of Puritan book was A Guide to Grand Jurymen, which was written by this guy named Richard Bernard, Bernard, I think, who laid down kind of the sort of English Protestant rules for witch hunting in, I believe, the 1640s. And even though it very much decried popery, decried Catholic, sort of as they saw it, superstitious and kind of ritualistic or magic based sort of tools to combat demonology, to combat the devil, a lot of the theological points that it makes and its sort of theological understanding of the problem of evil and how witchcraft works is pretty much copied identically from Malleus Maleficarum, from a lot of these Catholic sources. And Malleus Maleficarum itself is sort of it is sort of arguable how much influence it actually had. It's just a particularly vile and shocking and misogynistic book, so it's kind of been infamous in that way. But yeah, at the same time, they, even though they hated the Catholics did pioneer a lot of these witch hunting sort of techniques, and the Protestants and the Puritans definitely sort of leaned on them pretty heavily in a lot of ways.
Interesting.
Yeah.
When you were setting up the pre-production for this film and getting ready to actually move down this process, were there any elements that you knew, historically accuracy speaking, were not going to work, or that you knew you would have to bend and twist around, either for plot reasons or for just to make the story work? Was there anything that you said, okay, we have to set the history aside for this bit?
Yeah, no, there were a couple. I mean, for the most part, the sort of most important thing was to kind of was to have it be thematically and sort of psychologically accurate. You know what I mean? I think what I do think, if I may be so bold as to say so myself, what I think we do very, very well is to kind of replicate the Puritan ideology and the Puritan sort of way of thinking, and especially the psychological state of English veterans of King Philip's War, after the fact. The paranoia, the bigotry, the sort of the trauma, you know what I mean? And sort of how that would manifest, and especially kind of how that manifested sort of after our films takes place in the Salem witch trials, So, and the fear of the unknown, the fear of indigenous people, the fear of non-white people, although they would consider it more like non-Christians, you know what I mean? But we also kind of reckon a lot with the early history of slavery in our film as well. So that was the most important thing to get right. As far as material culture, it was just a question of getting it as correctly as possible within our budget, right? And there's definitely some costumes, some props and stuff where it's that's not quite right, but it's sort of the best we could do with the money that we had, which was not certainly not limitless. But and also only nerds will, and all due respect to nerds, but only nerds will notice these things. Now, as far as probably the biggest thing that we just kind of just threw the history out entirely was in how witchcraft and magic itself is portrayed, right? So obviously, sort of the major thing, and it may seem sort of obvious to a lot of people, but the major thing to kind of get out of the way real quick is that there were no witches, right? The witch only existed in the imagination of the witch hunter. So historically, these are just innocent women, right? There's a lot of Christian women, right? Innocent women killed for no reason. So this magic only existed in the imaginations of the witch hunters, of the inquisitors, and the way that they conceived of this magic was it kind of differed between Protestant and Catholic and between region to region, but specifically in the Protestant tradition and in the sort of tradition of the British Isles and North America, witchcraft wasn't really that sexy or exciting. It was usually pretty sort of mundane, and it a lot of it was agriculture based, right? It was just like crops failing and farm animals getting sick, and just various kind of misfortunes happening in a very kind of domestic, everyday sense. And we didn't want to do that because, frankly, that's not very interesting. We wanted to dial it up to 11. We wanted to take from the most lurid sort of Catholic witchcraft traditions, and then just take that and run with it into La La Land, essentially. Our system of magic, and the way that magic is portrayed is deeply countercultural. It's luridly sexual. It's highly surreal and psychedelic. Like, this stuff was not, and Lynchian. This was not how they would have conceived of it at the time. This is very much the way that our witches operate within the story, the function that they have in the story, and the actual magic that we portray as real in the film. This is a 21st century, right, invention of me and of, kind of the counterculture, and sort of how, but again, that was sort of important to sort of pit something particularly shocking and transgressive against our Puritan characters, right? So that's sort of the purpose of that. It's not to titillate, and it's not necessarily only to shock. It's to sort of imagine, all right, these conservative Christian Puritan men are investigating this devilry. What is the most shocking and horrifying thing that we can throw at them? You know what I mean? And also, it kind of, I think, says a lot about again, about sort of rebellion against conservatism and against authoritarianism in the modern day, and rebellion against prevailing cultural norms. Self-expression, there's kind of themes of queerness and homosexuality. There's themes of sexual liberation, of especially and very especially of feminism, and of women's rights, that we wanted to sort of touch on, that was just not really a factor for the Puritan witch hunters or for the witch trials historically.
Gotcha. So one thing that I'm also wanted to kind of pierce the veil a little bit and kind of get the behind the scenes look at, how does a movie like this actually start going from ideas floating around in your brain, from a script that you wrote in film school? How does that start turning into an actual motion picture? So again, trying to keep it as spoiler free as we can, but how do you go from, here's an idea I have where I want to play off attitudes of conservative Christian witch hunters, I want to play with modern attitudes towards witchcraft, indigenous people, feminism, so on. And how do you start turning that into a film? Like, where are the glimpses behind the curtain that you can give the audience for, we had to do this, and then we had to do this, and kind of like the boring details. This is Ask Historians, after all. We are interested in the boring details, kind of no matter what the field is.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to the question would be like, with great difficulty. It's, essentially it's a question of, it all starts with the script, right? Like, and that's generally what all good sort of drama and whether, film or theater or literature, that's kind of where it starts, is the writing, right? Is like, if the writing's there, then sort of that's where you've kind of got the story. So sort of wrote the script. I wrote the parts largely for friends of mine, for actor friends of mine, right? So we had a COVID delay, so not everybody who initially was on board could eventually do it, and we had to recast a couple of parts. And actually, I think we struck gold with the people that we found. But a lot of the vast majority of the actors that you see on screen in the film, those parts were written for them. So it's just a question of, I had collaborators, I had actor friends, filmmaking friends who were kind of hungry for work and were hungry to work on something meaningful, right? And kind of work for themselves and work on a story that they believed in, and sort of an independent project, and have a lot more power and control over both their artistic expression and also kind of the fruits of their labor, so basically it was just a question of assembling kind of the right people and assembling the team, and then a hell of a lot of coordination of schedules, a hell of a lot of sort of blood and sweat and treasure expended to sort of get everybody up to Massachusetts at a certain time, to coordinate people getting picked up from the airport, to gather props, to gather costumes. A lot of these costumes we had on special order from these historical tailors in the south of England. So it was kind of coordinating that, making sure that arrived on time. Yeah, I mean, incredibly, especially for a, we're what you would call a micro budget film, which is like not even enough to be low budget. It was a very mom and pop sort of operation, and really, but at the same time, this is a uh, for a micro budget film, this is a big production, right? We have it's a period piece, which is like, oh my god, I mean, everybody tells you never make a low budget period piece because it's just a whole lot more work. It's much more difficult. We filmed up in Massachusetts. Only one of the cast and crew members actually lived there, so we had to like get them up, and that was a whole lot of logistics, a whole lot of coordination. Getting hotels, getting lodging, making sure everybody had enough food. And then yeah, actually kind of getting out and filming it out in the woods in early April in Western Massachusetts. In the cold, in the rain. So if you want to learn more about sort of the making of this film, there's a 40-minute in-depth making of documentary that I'm almost as proud of as the movie itself, which you can buy or rent with the film on AtunSheiFilms.com. And I would encourage anybody who's and we have some crazy stories. I mean, we dealt with all sorts of problems on this movie, so I would encourage you guys to if you do watch the film, if you end up buying or renting the film, don't miss out on the making of documentary.
And I do want to encourage our audience here, like, buy the film. It is an enjoyable. It's not an experience that you might be used to, but I was entertained. I was floored the entire way through. I thought it was a delight. I sat out on my terrace, and I felt the best way to watch it would be in the cold with a drink and a cigar. And I think that heightened the experience of the movie for myself, at least.
Nice.
I was curious about one thing. So you did a lot of filming on location. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what were some of the reasons where you chose the locations for? Like, were you actually in particularly historically relevant areas, or was it, oh, this is an area where we're not going to get any cars making noise, so let's set up shop here and kind of call it a day?
Yeah, well, we shot in two main locations during principal photography, which the first was the Josiah Keith House in Easton, Massachusetts, which is the oldest house in that town. It's pretty close to Plymouth. It's a house built in 1718 or 1720, something like that. And that was certainly a historic location. Obviously, it's a little bit after our time period. But the homeowner is a guy named Justin Lewinter, who was incredibly gracious and incredibly kind, and let us take over his house. And the situation that we had there was absolutely fantastic, and just a really nice guy, very sweet guy. And so we ended up kind of going with that. So that was I think the most significant things, historical events that happened in the Josiah Keith House actually happened during the American Revolutionary War. So, although certainly that area, I mean, that's the heart of Wampanoag country. That was, where the Wampanoag under Metacom and under King Philip, were hiding out for a lot of King Philip's War, especially kind of the beginning part. So yeah, there's a lot of, there's definitely kind of the weight of history in that location. Our second location was in a little town called Worthington, Massachusetts, which is just up the mountain from Northampton. And that was basically, yeah, again, like chosen, like you said, because it was sort of this beautiful kind of wooded area. And we had sort of a farmhouse that we could stay in. And I wish we hadn't had to deal with the noise of cars as much as we did. But yeah, it was pretty out there. I mean, it's about as rural as Massachusetts gets. But yeah, it was also just very important, especially with our second location, to film in authentic sort of New England locations. The forest itself is kind of new growth, and botany nerds, I'm sure, will be able to tell the difference. That's not a 17th century forest, but there still is at least for me, somebody who's from Massachusetts, like you see a lot of Puritan films and shows, and and I can immediately tell when it's Georgia, or what I mean. It's it just it was important that it have that sort of the chill in the air that only Massachusetts can provide. It was important to actually film it locally, for me at least, just because so much of it is is because yeah, this is a Massachusetts movie through and through for sure.
Actually, on that topic, this is where I get to show my South Louisiana cred just a little bit slightly. I noticed that one of the locations was in Mandeville, Louisiana, and I just
Yeah,
had to
yeah.
ask, where in Mandeville were you filming? Because I want to know if I've walked by that spot accidentally.
You probably have. It was at the Fontainebleau State Park.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So right on the beach there, kind of when you go into the parking lot, there's like that walkway that goes out and like goes out into Lake Pontchartrain. And if you turn right at that beach and like walk a couple beaches down, that's where we were. And we totally had permission to shoot there, totally and completely. Yeah, everything was cleared with the state parks, totally. That stood in for. We do have a scene without getting too much into spoilers, but that stands in for Barbados. I don't think anybody from the Gulf Coast, I don't think that Spanish moss was fooling anybody. It doesn't look a whole lot like the Lesser Antilles, but yeah, we have a scene that takes place in Barbados.
Yeah, no, for me it was a little bit it's like I can tell. Oh, that's obviously that's the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah, when we had our New Orleans screening, that got a laugh when that cut, and it's an intense scene too. But like
it
that,
is.
people we're just like, people laughed.
Yeah, no, I had to ask that because I needed to know because I've probably walked by this location and I needed to
Oh yeah, no,
know.
I guarantee you have. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, looking through some of the other questions that we have for the non-spoiler section, and I imagine we'll have a little bit more to talk about in the spoiler section where we can kind of stop guarding it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of the actors were friends of yours, people that you had these roles written in mind for already. Were there any changes that you not for the script, but in the general process that kind of threw you for a curveball where it's like, oh, well, I had this idea, it's not working out, we had to change it, or I originally decided I wanted to set this during King Philip's War, or was like there anything that like had to radically change during the writing process in that pre-production stage before you actually got to the actual demands of filming?
I mean, I think what the biggest thing that changed was kind of was just the script, and I don't think it necessarily had to change. It just, I'm glad that it did. I think it did for sort of for all the better for the script, because we had a COVID delay, right? We were going to shoot this in May of 2020. That did not happen, but the script was originally written in 2019, and so we took a delay for 2 years. And during that time, I occasionally kind of went back to the script, and this was also kind of the time that my channel first blew up. So I had a bunch of other projects, kind of for YouTube. But every once in a while, I'd kind of go back to Sudbury, and I back to the Sudbury Devil, that is, and I would sort of tweak it, and I would improve some stuff, and I would rewrite. And at one point, especially, so in the summer of 2021, I basically rewrote the whole script. Like, not it wasn't, I guess, that different, but sort of I consciously didn't just kind of copy paste scenes and then move them around. I just like I had the an older draft of the script on the computer, but I also had just a new document, where I just completely typed out everything again, right? And also kind of changed things as I went, and kind of what I had discovered, and also kind of thanks to some I guess thoughts that I had been dealing with, and some personal sort of things that are happening in my life, and some just, I guess, revelations that I'd had. I found that the film really wanted to kind of coalesce around one kind of strong central theme, which is this idea of America's foundational rot, right? And so this kind of originally this film was a little scattershot. It was basically just kind of a collection of folk horror craziness, sort of wrapped up in this little horror story. It was all right, right? It was a freaky, fun little sort of folk horror film, but I think kind of what it eventually became with that delay and with the rewrites was sort of this dark creation myth about sort of the foundation of America, and has a very sort of, and deals, and I think it was much more profoundly concerned with like how these characters, the historical people that they're kind of loosely based on, or the historical, psychology that they represent, how that sort of proved to how that reverberates even today, and how that has proved such a key, kind of cornerstone in American life.
Starting now with the spoiler discussion, we can kind of start talking about the parts where, assuming you've seen the movie, what we can talk about more loosely, talk about the developments and the kind of major ideas behind particular developments, ideas, plots, characters, etc. The first one that I wanted to do, it's not actually one I had on the list, but it's something that you mentioned previously. One of the interesting things about this film that I first noticed was that the witches are composed of a widowed woman, a man who is disabled, and an enslaved African woman. Was that a conscious decision to set that up in opposition to the conservative, Christian, Protestant, evangelical, whatever adjectives you want to use there, to portray them either as decidedly other but more sympathetically? Was there an element of, we're trying to break these characters in particular, and how can we get outside of their frame of reference and understanding them most? Can you kind of walk us through that decision for why are the witches the way that they are in the movie?
Yeah, no, well, yeah. I mean, yes, to all of the above. I mean, that was a very conscious decision to basically have our sort of little witch hippie commune, polycule in the woods, be matriarchal, right? And where sort of we have, kind of two witches and a thrall. We've got Patience, Flora, and Goodenow, who's the sort of the farmer who it becomes kind of their servant, and very conscious as well to have sort of the man be in a subservient role, and have the sort of essentially the theologian and the soldier, right? These sort of like pinnacles of masculinity in New England sort of culture at that time, essentially be these objectified, you know, these objectified sex objects tied to a tree with their shirts off. Very much conscious. And I mean, again, it was that inversion that was so interesting to play with, which is sort of how, which is sort of having, and there is sort of I think a great tradition of this in counterculture, and it does sort of fit in as well, very well with our premier hosts, the Satanic Temple. I think that oftentimes the symbols of Satan, of the devil, of witchcraft, have been utilized in counterculture to represent a rebellion against tradition, against conservatism, against sort of Christianity in its worst sort of aspects and its most sort of authoritarian aspects.
Somewhere
And
John Milton
therefore,
is spinning, but
yeah. Well, it's like, and it is a form of rebellion, and therefore I think can be quite empowering to women, to queer people, to people of color. I mean, I think there was and you might know about this being a Louisiana boy, but even though Louisiana voodoo or voodoo is this syncretized Christian religion, it's at the same time, Satan isn't conceived of as the adversary or as this ultimate evil. Satan is more of a trickster, and is kind of more of this sort of, I guess, Loki kind of figure, right? Who sort of sometimes is malevolent, but at the same time isn't just, it isn't this Zoroastrian sort of theological kind of like good versus evil type of battle. Like it is this, the devil is this trickster who is sort of pursuing kind of his own ends, and sometimes I'm blanking on the name of the book, so please take this with a grain of salt. But in one particular book about Louisiana voodoo that I've read, it framed Satan historically among enslaved populations as essentially this kind of figure of rebellion against the sort of the white Christian god of the masters, right, and of the enslavers. And especially the way that Satan is often described in the Salem witch trials as well. There's kind of a racial element. Satan is often described as a black man. Of course, race as a concept was in its infancy at this point. We can certainly look back and say, oh, that was racist, and be accurate. But at the same time, right, this wasn't, sort of race having been socially constructed in order to justify the economic gains from exploitation involved with slavery and colonialism. It wasn't really until the early 18th century that these concepts really kind of coalesced in European philosophy, religion, and science. So this was kind of before that, but at the same time, the Satan in the Salem witch trials was ascribed the sort of phenotypical sort of attributes of an indigenous person, especially of an indigenous warrior, coming out of King Philip's War. And during the Salem witch trials, of course, King William's War was the war that was going on against Quebec and the Wabanaki Confederacy at that time, and legitimately so. I mean, in King Philip's War and King William's War, indigenous forces committed horrific atrocities. So sort of legitimately so, there was this fear and this hatred for this enemy that really kind of coalesced in New England culture at this time. So we're playing with all of that, right? So it's kind of it's all of that kind of distilled into these two characters in particular of Patience and Flora, especially in that way of Patience being this woman who was clearly abused by my character, Mr. Gavitt, her dead husband, and was clearly a victim of misogyny and a victim of patriarchal oppression. And then, obviously it goes without saying that Flora, as an enslaved woman, a victim of white supremacist oppression and colonialist oppression. So yeah, they make a hell of a team, Flora and Patience, in that way.
In your depiction of the witches and their kind of life out in the woods, you mentioned earlier that you were drawing more from particularly Catholic viewpoints on what witches were like and what they were up to. And you mentioned the confluence of the intense sexualization, the intense graphic over the top, like dialing it up to 11. Was there a particular narrative source or anything that you were drawing some of this stuff from? Or was it just, this is some really cool stuff that we can put on film and it's going to do more for our purposes as filmmakers? Kind of what was the interplay between the history of how witches were portrayed at this time and your own portrayal of them on camera? Was there anything that you were like, okay, this doesn't really match the sources, but it makes for a good plot point, makes for a good shot, and makes for a good part of what we're trying to do as artists?
Yeah, pretty much that, right? Sort of the latter of what you originally said, which is kind of, it wasn't particularly based on any sort of one source. It was more just sort of the intense sexual anxieties and preoccupations of the Catholic witch hunters. That was sort of a good jumping off point. A lot of the sexual elements were put in, some of which were kind of put into, again, to sort of play on these themes. Like there's some on-screen homosexuality, with Goodenow licking his own cum off the cum rock. Lovely scene for the whole family. And Flora and Patience.
Is that the name for the rock in the script or in the production?
That came later. That it's the cum rock it was in the script. It was the stone or the altar stone, but ever since the premiere at the Satanic Temple and a lot of the subsequent early screenings, cum rock #cum rock became what the internet christened the rock, and so it is. I will accept the people's gracious judgment of the cum rock. We actually also sell cum rock merch on AtunSheiFilms.spring.com. But yeah, there's sort of that homosexuality. Flora and Patience kiss at one point in the film. There's sort of open homosexuality. So there's certain sexual elements, polyamory is sort of not necessarily gone into in that much depth, but it's portrayed on screen at certain points. There's sort of this orgiastic sort of public sexual element to the witch's coven. So it's kind of touched on, so that kind of stuff was, again, like sort of drawing kind of those modern parallels of sort of of sexual liberation, and obviously that those sorts of things are not necessarily for everyone, but if that is your thing, you should be able to do it, in my opinion. And the Puritans obviously would disagree with me, but yeah, so there's sort of that element of sexual liberation. A lot of it as well was sort of meant to be a bit of a commentary on what was sort of happening. Like, for example, in the kiss between Patience and Flora, if you have two beautiful women on screen kissing very passionately in a big close up, that's exploitation. If you have a man immediately pull down his pants and start masturbating to it, then that's commentary, right? Like, so that was intentional in that sense. A lot of the other ones, however, were kind of there because they made me laugh, and because I thought it would be fun. Sort of, obviously, we stuck with our central theme, and we really don't, there really is not there's no sort of, there really was no intention to titillate particularly, other than the fact that, sex is an important part of life, and I think sex should be portrayed on screen much more than it is. But but yeah, I mean, for example, the sex scene between Patience and Goodenow, where she's kind of she's in grief over the Yoda disappearance of Flora, and she's trying to kind of make herself feel better. And he says, "Oh mother, oh mother!" I just like cackled for 3 hours after I wrote that, and just thought it was hilarious. So that's why that's in there. Now, the sort of the scene that a lot of people ask me about is the sort of the ultimate hate fuck, the knife fight, the final scene where Patience and Fletcher are killing each other actively, and their guts are tumbling out, and then they have sex in order to conceive of the Antichrist. There's more of a method to my madness with that one, which is essentially, in literature and mythology, in philosophy, sex and death are often very closely intertwined. And I think, there's a very good reason for that. It's not only is it the sort of cycle of death and rebirth, kind of death and birth are, of course, kind of two sides of the same coin. But I also think there's sort of the yearning for like oblivion, you know what I mean? In the orgasm, there's the little death, that sort of moment of oblivion that you experience, in poetry and philosophy and literature, very often compared to the moment of death. Those sort of having those two things sort of intertwined in that way. And also, again, speaking of influence, is very much inspired by the knife fight in Ravenous, where, there's this very intense homoeroticism between the two characters, and they don't, there is no sort of explicit romance, but just search on Tumblr and you'll find all sorts of fan art. It's famously and intentionally on the part of the director and actors, famously they're very intense eroticism in that sort of act of killing, in that act of violence. So yeah, that was very much sort of intentional. I will say as well about that to, I guess, kind of respond to a criticism that I've seen multiple times about that scene is it kind of bothers me how some reviewers have portrayed that as that scene as sexual violence. Personally, I would define sexual violence as the lack of consent, and there is no non-consensual sex in the Sudbury Devil. You could very much argue that there are power dynamics that make things kind of creepy and gross. That's certainly a valid interpretation, but specifically in that scene between Patience and Fletcher, the consent is extremely enthusiastic. What it isn't sexual violence; it's sex and violence, or sex together with violence. And again, sort of as with so much of this film, it serves an allegorical purpose.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the questions that I had when I was watching it, not really a question, it's kind of one of those things that is left unsaid, is what happens to Josiah Cutting? Because, again, we're in the spoiler section, like, he dies, and it's not a particularly, or at least the implication that I got was that it was not a particularly quick or enjoyable process for him to getting into the state, and it happens off screen and all that kind of stuff. So how do you reconcile those two statements where Josiah Cutting is kind of left at the mercy of this witch coven for a while Fletcher tries to go and escape, and kind of we characterized him earlier as the brains and the brawn. What happens to the brains when the brawn is gone?
Yeah, well, I think I think as far as Cutting's death, I think that um, sort of what I kind of sort of what's happening in that scene is that uh, essentially Patience is sacrificing Goodenow, or he sacrifices himself to presumably provide some sort of mystical power, wherein Patience can sort of utilize sort of Cutting's maleness to create this golem that she creates. Of essentially this avatar of her dead husband, this glamour that she then sort of projects herself as and sort of poses as her dead husband for the next 20 minutes of the film. And as such, Cutting is sort of left, sort of almost radioactive. Like something sort of went horribly wrong with his body. There's some Cronenberg sort of weirdness going on, which you're right, we don't exactly explain, and we only show very briefly and in very, very tight close-ups. And we never get the full picture. And so, yeah, I think sort of, though I think with Cutting's character, I do think that when Fletcher does sort of get taken in by the witch's coven, Cutting is kind of left powerless. You know what I mean? Because he's just an ideas man, but without sort of the physical force to enforce those ideas. He's kind of just nothing. We talk about this a lot with the cast, and especially with Josh Papa, who plays Cutting, is that even though he dies much later in the film, there's this scene that he and Fletcher have where uh, Cutting, where Fletcher's been taken in by the witches. Cutting is their prisoner, and he goes up to Fletcher and says, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna grab your sword. And I'm gonna kill her and kill Patience. And Fletcher says, "Well, do it then." And Cutting just has this breakdown, right? He just can't. He just sort of realizes how impotent he is, how impotent he's always been. And I think we talked about this with Josh, which was like, that's, even though he technically, his life ends later, kind of that's the moment where he actually dies, like kind of everything that makes him him dies in that moment. And I think I think Cutting kind of represents a level of authority in sort of the colonial project and in this sort of repressive form of Christianity that Fletcher, even though he enforces this order, he's ultimately also kind of a bit of a pawn of. He's a tool of, and and I think that kind of in Fletcher's kind of redemption arc, I suppose, throughout the film, he he sort of learns to reject that that premise and that social order that essentially has destroyed his life as kind of a foot soldier of the colonial project. It's kind of destroyed his life just as much as it has Patience's or Flora's. Just in a much more indirect way. He's this he grew up in poverty. He describes himself as being a dock rat before he joined this company of militia and fought in King Philip's War, and sort of then that sort of propelled him, because he became this war hero. It kind of propelled him to this higher social station. But he's this sort of this poor working class sort of dock worker or sailor or something who essentially is being used in much the same way, and we see in his monologue where he's basically confessing to all this horrible stuff that he did and these murder of innocent civilians during King Philip's War. We see that his life has been ruined by this too, right? Like, he will never be able to forgive himself for the things that he's done, and he shouldn't be forgiven, right? He does. I mean, he pays her. He fucking dies. Like, he dies horribly, right? And there's justice in that because he deserves to die because he's a child killer. If that answers your question.
So that actually gets to an idea that I've kind of been kicking around. And if you don't want to answer this question to preserve mystery for the film because you're not quite sure about it yourself, that's totally fair. Who would you say is the antagonist of the film?
Good question. I don't know if there is one. I mean, I think some people will say Patience. Some people will say Cutting. I think largely uh, people who I think largely a lot of the audience of the film so far, and I think certainly the people who would get the most out of the film would argue that Cutting is the antagonist, right? As again, kind of the capital W white man, this theologian, this enforcer of the colonial project of patriarchy of white supremacy. Um, you know, but of course, Patience, in a narrative sense, Patience the witch is, in a narrative sense, the antagonist, right? She kind of plays that role. She's the one directly in opposition to our main characters, who we're following. Um, I think you could maybe argue that Patience begins as the antagonist and ends as a protagonist. I don't know. I mean, I think it's up to audience interpretation. I do think I certainly think that, and I kind of, and sometimes I would kind of get into it with some of the cast and crew members about this as well, like on set, who would sort of describe Cutting as a villain, just straight up, and I would kind of push back against them a little bit and say, no, I don't think he is. I think he just thinks that he knows everything, right? He just like thinks he's got everything figured out. He thinks he's got the world figured out. In Puritanism, there was this sort of millenarianism, right? There was this apocalypticism, this idea that the end of the world was coming, that sort of these were the last days, and kind of what else is there to figure out about the world if it's about to end, there was the sense that Puritanism was kind of the last, best, truest, purest, as the name implies, sort of iteration of Christianity before the end times. I told Josh in his portrayal of it, and I was saying, if he were alive today, Cutting would have 10,000 Twitter followers, and he'd be on there all the time. He's somebody with a master's degree and too much time on Twitter. Yeah, and I think that's sort of what we're going for. And I think it's important to, even though I have absolutely no problem, and I do think that there should, I don't think it's the job of the historian to be purely impartial when it comes to things like mass murder or slavery, right? I don't think, I personally, probably some members of your audience will disagree with me, and that's totally fine. I accept that and accept that perspective, but I don't think it's even though it's not necessarily the role of the historian to deliver moral lessons. I don't think there's anything wrong with being sort of upfront about just calling these things what it is, which is which is something, a horrible crime, right? And an outrage. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, but I also think that it's not that even the perpetrators of such horrific acts need to be approached with empathy in history. I don't think the question is, should we judge historical people? I think the question should be, should we empathize with historical people? And that includes empathizing with, the quote unquote villains of history, the quote unquote monsters of history. At the same time, though, that means if you're going to extend that empathy further, and it's kind of the great failing, I think, of a lot of, quote unquote unbiased and objective history, is that, for example, in another field of interest of mine, the Civil War, there's, don't judge the Confederates. Don't judge them. Don't judge them. Don't judge them. Show empathy. Don't pass judgment. See where things are coming from their perspective. And I guess my answer to that is, okay, I will see where they're coming from, but I'm also going to see what was going on with the people that they enslaved, right? And I'm going to be honest about what they thought and what their lives were like and what their perspective was like. And just inevitably, that's going to make the Confederates look pretty bad, right? It's not necessarily that it's not demonization. It's just looking at it from the perspective of their victims, right? And considering the victim's perspective. I've gotten a little bit off topic here, but anyway, no, so that's, I think I think it's important to, that's what we said with Cutting, was like, think about him from the modern perspective. There are a million Cuttings running around. And frankly, a lot of them are not conservative Christians. They're people who maybe think like me, who are kind of on the more progressive side of things, but they just so arrogantly think that they've got everything figured out philosophically and metaphysically and morally.
Until someone tells them to actually pick up the sword.
Well, yeah, and then there's that, appropriate, because I'm actually writing a video right now about John Brown.
Oh, I look forward to that. One character I wanted to ask you about, who has very limited screen time, but obviously has a very outsized influence on the psychological and the kind of interior lives, particularly of Fletcher, is the unnamed French person. I'm not sure what their exact title is.
Yeah, the Coeur de
Um,
Bois, the runner of the woods. Yeah, yeah.
so who is offering the money for the heads of various indigenous people slain, and that their whole deal with the child killing is that's how he made his living, was supplying the French. Was that a real thing that happened? Is that pure artistic license? Do you just really hate the Quebecois and had to stick it to them a little bit?
So the head hunting didn't happen. The selling body parts absolutely did, with great um, uh, frequency during King Philip's War. However, it was what I really wanted was that image of the guy lifting a severed head out of a bag.
Mhm.
Um,
It's a striking
Practically,
image.
however,
So I
it's
had
a
to. I
striking image.
actually. I paused it for a second just to kind of. I was also a cigar and 2 glasses of whiskey deep at that point. Um, so there were a whole lot of thoughts racing through my mind. I had to pause it for a second. I actually had a question about
Sure,
that, which we can get to in a little bit.
sure.
Sorry, continue. I was just going to say it
Oh
is
yeah,
a very striking image.
yeah, for sure. But I wanted that image. But if you think about it practically, especially for the Coeur de Bois, right? These kind of fur traders and gun traders who were sort of just traveling around the woods of upstate New York, of northern New England, and of southern Quebec and Ontario and the Great Lakes at this time. Um, Severed heads are heavy, scalps, noses, ears, much lighter. So that's the sort of body part sort of hunting and stuff that you would see at this time, and there'd be a number of reasons to collect body parts, to prove how many of the enemy that you had killed. Specifically for their Coeur de Bois, he mentions that he'll give the Mohawk Fletcher's regards. Sort of our idea was that he needs Wampanoag body parts because the Wampanoag and Mohawk were enemies during the winter of 1675. That he would kind of give the Mohawk Wampanoag body parts as kind of a gesture of like friendship, so he could like maybe open trading negotiations or something, or like stay with them for the winter or something like that. You know what I mean? So and that kind of thing. As a a not just as a, it wasn't just a uh, both an ornamentation, right? I mean, we hear stories. Mary Rowlandson talks about this in her captivity narrative during King Philip's War. Our indigenous warriors, including a lot of like apostatized Christian natives, dressed like Puritans, dressed in English clothing, but with like a ring of ears around their neck. It's really ghoulish stuff. But it wouldn't just be this ornamentation. It wouldn't just be necessarily this sort of proof of a raid or proof of victory. It would also be sort of these means of exchange, right? Of that if you could bring a body parts from an enemy group to another group, then you could kind of ingratiate yourself within that. So yeah.
And so that actually gets to the question that I had about the shot of the head. What was the process behind getting that head made? Did you just call up a makeup studio and say, "I need a head"? Like, was this just like a Halloween decoration that you gussied up? Like, can you just walk
Yeah,
us through the
yeah.
process?
It was pretty much a Halloween decoration that we gussied up. Yeah. So I got it at a like a haunted house supplier store online. And basically kind of what I did from there was I added some more blood stains, and I sort of painted it up to maybe look a little bit more rotted than it was. Um, but yeah, no, it really worked great. But yeah, it was like styrofoam or something. I've got it at my studio. It's just sitting on a shelf, like staring out.
That's a mental image to have on the work desk right there.
Yeah, exactly.
One question that I wanted to ask was about the visuals that are used for the hauntings themselves. In the story, there's obviously a lot of light, the kind of the play between the lights that are moving through the forest, how Goodfellow is like luring these people in with his story about the lights. How much of that was coming from your visual effects artist? How much of that was coming from your vision for what this phenomena should look like? How much of that was just special effects are expensive, so let's put a big old lens flare on the camera and call it a day?
So we actually did that effect, the orb of light, did mostly practically. So basically, the way that we did it was our cinematographer, camera operator, grip, best boy, gaffer, everything in the G&E department. He basically rigged a very bright light, circular light, on a big boom pole, and it attached to the swivel, and we basically just swiveled it in a big arc through the woods, and so it just would cast the shadows that a sort of a very bright orb of light naturally would cast. And then our visual effects supervisor Blair Rowan basically painted out the machinery, painted out the wires, painted out the boom, and added more flare, added more of kind of a circular spherical kind of like sort of almost liquid mercury type of shape to it. But yeah, most of that was done practically, and that's a lot of the, again, and budget was definitely a consideration. A big part of the sort of supernatural occurrences and the hauntings that we show are kind of our I guess our mandate with that was to sort of, and our idea was to sort of think, okay, like what would be off-putting in a period setting, right? And this ball of light thing we quickly kind of settled on. It actually, that idea we sort of stole from ourselves. We ripped ourselves off. Eduardo and I, the cinematographer, and I had planned on writing a script for a while about aliens in the 1890s. That it was like this, it was sort of this haunted house movie on the sort of North Shore of Massachusetts, on this like rocky coast in Cape Ann, and the sort of Victorian sort of Gothic ghost story, but with like UFOs. And so, what we thought would be kind of a cool image for that would be basically the spaceship, this giant light, sort of this giant electric light, sort of going through the woods, and in this very kind of like Gothic sort of candlelit world, we thought that'd be kind of a nice and creepy image. And so, but this is sort of the same, so we ripped that off, and it was sort of the same thing for this, right? It's like having a big, bright electric light, especially a disembodied one, in a period film in a world lit only by fire is just a off-putting, unsettling image, just fundamentally. And also, a lot of the sort of modern flashes that we see in the climax of the film, the flashes to modern Boston.
About that next, actually.
Yeah, of course, that fits in, very much with our theme of this sort of stuff, this kind of curse reverberating throughout history, the influence of history on the modern day. But at the same time, that's also just that's a very shocking image to have in a period film, right? It's like a very bold choice. And that's something that was just fundamentally unsettling, and was also just something to again, like you said, was just cheaper, was just easier to do using not a lot of resources.
I was going to actually ask about the practical versus the computer generated effects, because a great deal of the film looks to be practical. A lot of the, for lack of a better word, the gore and the viscera and so on seems to be all practical. Was that a conscious decision you went in doing? Was that an affinity for practical over computer generated? Was that a budgetary requirement, or was there something else going on when you were figuring out how you were actually going to portray both the fight and sex of Fletcher and Patience, and then the other scenes that involve the casting off of various body parts and so on?
The biggest visual effect in the movie is actually the house, the exterior of the Josiah Keith house in the beginning. And I've talked about this a few times, but basically, it was, even though this is a historic house, it struck people that we showed the first cut to as modern. Now, the Josiah Keith house is painted bright yellow, and that's not crazy. People would have painted their houses yellow back in the day. But for people who didn't really know any better, who didn't know that this was a historic house, people thought that the yellow was off-putting, that it was too modern looking. And so we kind of thought, okay, well, this is just not acceptable, right? Like, this is going to be most people watching the movie. Most people are not going to be giant nerds and are not going to immediately recognize the architecture. They're going to think that this is a modern house. And it's so crucial when you're making a low budget film, especially a period film, to be able to kind of sell the reality of that period to your audience. And this is like the third shot of the movie or the fourth shot of the movie, something like that. So So basically, Blair, our long-suffering but incredibly amazing trooper of a VFX artist, had to go through frame by frame and add distressing to the house. I mean, he did a phenomenal job. It's completely seamless. But yeah, it took way too long and was a giant pain in the ass. As far as other elements, we either did practical or mostly practical. The weird blobs in the sky, those are we shot those elements practically. Those are basically bits of paint and ink and fucking oat milk and various things kind of floating around in a. So those were basically ink and paint in these sort of clear glass jugs of water, and then we kind of took those out, took the background out, and Blair put them on our shots of the sky, and so we have these kind of nice, weird, swirling kind of planets in the sky.
One question I wanted to ask. So you mentioned that there are homages to various films. There are a lot of influences coming from other films. If you were going to say there was one particular thing that was your flair, your addition to the film that is distinctively your style, what do you think it was?
I think the thing that's most mine is the dialogue. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time kind of just perfecting this really weird, useless, odd skill of writing in early modern English and imitating this way of speaking and this way of writing. And that just comes from just soaking early modern English texts up like a sponge. And there's influences from uh, the literature of King Philip's War, just in terms of phrase, in diction. There's influences from Shakespeare, certainly. Like there's a scene where a line we're cutting says, "By Jesu, he speaks." I mean, that's like classic Shakespeare, right? It's like very Elizabethan. And yeah, so just the dialogue, I think, and also the the setting. I mean, right, this is a very personal film to me. I mean, it takes place in my hometown, and and as kind of it's not only sort of a creation myth for America, but very much for the sort of milieu that I grew up in, right, in the community that I'm from. And of course, I think also just the this particular kind of brand of sex and violence and lunacy is something that I find myself very drawn to, and that's in a lot of my projects. And I think is maybe perhaps not unique to me. I mean, there's a lot of sickos out there, but it's the stuff that I really love and really love sort of doing. And yeah, again, like I said, just writing some of these scenes and just cracking myself up by just how strange and off the wall it is.
You mentioned the location, Sudbury town where you grew up and so on. Is the Sudbury Devil an actual cryptid, an actual folklore? Was it something you invented for the film? Was it just the visual of, the devil in the womb and the birth of the Antichrist and so on? Can you walk us through why did you settle on that particular imagery, location, and so on?
So it's not a cryptid, though I sort of hope it becomes one. That would be fun. But no, I made that up. But yeah, that it kind of really just came from that title, right? It was the Sudbury Devil, like, oh, good title. Obviously, yeah. Again, it sort of calls up associations with like the Jersey Devil and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I mean, it pretty much just I wanted to have. Uh, Essentially this kind of personification, this sort of antichrist personification of sort of all of these people's traumas and their vendettas and their vindictiveness um, and again, kind of to manifest as this creature that's kind of this living curse that will then kind of go on to punish this community and this region and this country for all time, right? Very much this sort of manifestation, this personification of original sin was the sort of idea behind that, uh, and Yeah, and obviously you're making a devil film. You need the man himself, or at least his only begotten son, to show up at one point.
For the visual of the devil, was that also practically done? Was that another Halloween prop?
Yeah, no, that was me in a suit, in a monster suit. I bought these amazing uh, like sort of leggings, these faux fur leggings with these hooves. They kind of ended in these high heel shoes that are a huge bitch to walk around in, and a big old goat head that sort of goes on your head. It's this big old mask. Sort of goes on a bit like and yeah, and so sort of to and it was kind of me without my shirt, and we tell a story about this in the making of documentary. I was actually slathered in mud and slime to sort of make me look a little less human, and a little bit more kind of like I guess sort of frayed skin and stuff like that. But yeah, I kind of wanted to have this image, not only obviously sort of the goat headed man is very. There's a lot of strong associations in 19th century representations of like Baphomet and stuff, which again also been sort of appropriated by modern day Satanists in a big way and the occult in a big way. But I also thought there was something kind of cool and sort of almost ancient Egyptian about this sort of god antichrist baby thing, right? This sort of this shirtless sort of animal headed entity that had these wonderful kind of hieroglyphic associations in my mind, at least. But yeah, and really kind of the key, of course, as with any kind of good practical monster, especially on low budget, was just being very smart about how we lit it, and doing a lot of backlight and a lot of negative space to leave most of the creature kind of up to the imagination.
So, with all this work that you've done, because you've obviously been very prominent in plugging, in supporting, in trying to push the Sudbury Devil on your YouTube channel, what are the ramifications on the broader Atun-Shei cinematic universe, if you will, for how does the Sudbury Devil interplay with Checkmate Lincolnites, with the Witchfinder General, with the Frozen 50s Man, and all the other series that we know and love as dedicated viewers of your
Yeah, I
channel?
mean, it doesn't really, but yeah, I mean, if I think the Atun-Shei expanded universe is just a wonderfully stupid excuse to sometimes get different kind of Atun-Shei characters into each other's series, in just the most contrived Marvelitist way imaginable, But I don't know. I think it's funny, but no, it doesn't tie in at all with the Atun-Shei expanded universe. But it's very much kind of its own thing. That said, I think that if you are familiar with my work, and especially if you're familiar with, if you've watched my King Philip's War playlist, I've got a playlist on my channel. It's called King Philip's War in chronological order. It's videos about King Philip's War and also clips from other videos about like colonial New England or Puritanism or whatever that relate to King Philip's War. They're kind of pulled and put sort of in timeline and in a way that makes sense, in the playlist. I think especially watching that playlist, this film will be a much, much richer experience. For people to watch, and in that playlist, it's ongoing. It's an ongoing project. I suspect I'll never be completely finished with it. Eventually, I hope to make it kind of a bit of a chronicle of the entire conflict, just by addressing kind of various aspects of it in different videos. That will definitely give you like a shorthand for sort of when the characters talk about the Sudbury fight, when they talk about the Great Swamp Massacre, when they talk about the Nipmuc and the Narragansett and all these things, you're going to know exactly where they're coming from. Whereas a viewer kind of coming into it blind, they're not going to be confused, right? It's obvious what's going on, but they'll just think, oh, that's just some Native American nation, or oh, that's just some random battle or whatever. Like it's going to be a much richer experience if you've watched the channel. And to that end, I think that like while this film is quite intense and not for everybody, well, obviously if you're in the spoiler section, you've probably seen it already, but just in case you've skipped ahead to the conclusion, I do think that if you love history, if you like what I do, if you've enjoyed my work in the past, and you love good historical fiction, I think that this movie's absolutely going to be for you, especially if you're a pervert and especially if you love horror. So, yeah, I would just say, go to AtunSheiFilms.com and pick yourself up a copy. It's available to buy or rent, together with more than 6 hours of special features.
All right, and I think that's a good place to go ahead and end it. And I do encourage all of our viewers. I've watched the movie. I had an excellent time watching it. I thought it was very well done. I thought it was an experience that I'm not likely to forget anytime soon. That's certainly a way to put it. And thank you for coming back on the channel and kind of walking us through this behind the scenes look of the film, the themes, the characters, and all that kind of nitty gritty that I'm sure our viewers are going to eat up when they get to be able to listen to the other side of the story. And it's not just the finished screen product, it's also the additional work that went on behind the scenes too.
Well, actually, speaking of buying the movie, one thing I should mention that I think we'll have that your listeners will have, sort of unique interest in, is that we actually do a historical commentary in the special features. It's me and Dr. Justin Sledge, who's an expert in Western occultism. He's been on my channel a number of times. We've collaborated a number of times. He's a good friend of mine, and he runs the YouTube channel Esoterica, an excellent academic study of magic, religion, witchcraft, and the occult. And that's a real treat, and it was a real pleasure to be able to do that with him. I would just say, there's not only is there lots of cool behind the scenes sort of nerdy filmmaking stuff, but plenty of stuff for the history nerds too. So yeah, I hope you'll check it out. And thanks again so much for having me on.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.